lies to support spiritual wifery, and more. One of the most troubling things has been the tremendous amount of lying and deception that has occurred to protect polygamy and power. With the practice now mostly gone, the deception has continued to protect this falsified history, and the church and its leaders, lying and deception for a higher cause, was used early on to conceal polygamy from the federal government via 13 different names for it. Deception then became an institutional practice. Many left and are leaving the church because of it. According to a number of historians employed by the LDS Church, our history is far from authentic. Assistant church historian Charles Wesley Wandel has much to say about our corrupt official history. The official history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the documentary History of the Church, or DHC, was published in book form under the direction of the First Presidency in 1902. The introductory assurance that no historical or doctrinal statement has been changed is demonstrably wrong, overshadowed by editorial censorship, hundreds of deletions, additions, and alterations. These 7 volumes are not always reliable. The 19th century propaganda mill was so adroit that few outside Brigham Young's inner circle were aware of the behind-the-scenes alterations so seamlessly stitched into church history. Wandel had first-hand knowledge of how and why our history was modified. He worked directly with Dr. Willard Richards in Nauvoo. Following Richards' return from his English mission, he became the church historian and recorder. Wandel expressed shock at the many changes made to Joseph's personal diary by Richards, Clayton, and others. Commenting on the vast number of changes made in this historical work as it was being serialized in the Deseret News, Wandel noted, "I noticed the interpolations because having been employed in the historian's office at Nauvoo by Dr. Richards, and employed too in 1845 in compiling this very autobiography, I know that after Joseph's death, his memoir was doctored to suit the new order of things, polygamy, and this too by the direct order of Brigham Young to Dr. Richards and systematically by Richards. The Quorum of the 12 under Brigham Young's leadership began altering the historical records shortly after Smith's death. Contrary to the introduction's claim, Smith did not author the history of the church. At the time of his 1844 death, the narrative had been written up to the 5th of August, 1838. There are 5 favorite deception methods employed to deceive people and keep them ignorant of the truth. All 5 of them have been employed to make Joseph Smith out to be a polygamist. First, ignore or bury the truth. Lock it away in vaults. Bury it in complexity or rarely address it. 2. Discredit, demean, and diminish other credible sources of truth, those in the Smith family. 3. Distract and divert others from the truth. Keep people busy or distracted with other things. 4. Modify existing truths. Change official history, private journals, etc. 5. Create new false records and narratives to negate truth via false affidavits, stories, and statements. One of many doctrine examples, Joseph forbids it, polygamy, and the practice thereof. One of the most important journal entries by the prophet Joseph Smith in connection with polygamy is his October 5, 1843 entry, recorded by William Clayton. It has been modified to promote polygamy. He and Joseph were walking the public streets of Nauvoo together on this date. Clayton recorded an anti-polygamy statement by Joseph. 10 years later, it was changed by historians under Brigham Young's direction to reflect a pro-polygamy stance, then put in the official history of the church. Both versions are presented here. In their effort to falsely prove that Joseph was a polygamist, church historians deleted 10 key words from Joseph Smith's original statement. then added 49 other words. Based on the Joseph Smith Papers timeline for this compilation, the illustrated example would have probably been edited sometime between 1853 and 1855, after George A. Smith took over duties for the deceased Willard Richards. Both Willard Richards and George A. Smith were Freemasons, apostles, and members of the secret chamber at Nauvoo. Both men became counselors in the first presidency to Brigham Young. The entry does not describe a public moment, but instead Joseph's private journal entry made by his personal scribe, William Clayton, after the two walked the public streets of Nauvoo. It occurred 3 months after July 12, 1843, the supposed date that Brigham Young said Joseph had the pro-polygamy revelation, now known as Doctrine and Covenants 132. Modern LDS scholars with access to church archives found both statements. Joseph's original, undoctored quotation is in an untitled journal of 278 manuscript pages, as identified in the handwriting of Willard Richards, secret chamber member, another scribe of Joseph. Richards recorded, "Walked up and down street with scribe and gave instructions to try those who were preaching, teaching, or practicing the doctrine of plurality of wives. On this law, Joseph forbids it and the practice thereof. No man shall have but one wife." Rest of the page blank. An American Prophet's Record, the diaries and journals of Joseph Smith. Falling, trained in history at BYU and elsewhere, pointed out that the rest of the page was blank, allowing for future doctoring. The edited version is the one that ended up in the Official History of the Church, Volume 3, page 46, Changes Made, 1853 through 55. It states, "Gave instructions to try those persons who were preaching, teaching, or practicing the doctrine of plurality of wives. For, according to the law, I hold the keys of this power in the last days, for there is never but one on earth at a time on whom the power and its keys are conferred. And I have constantly said no man shall have but one wife at a time, unless the Lord directs otherwise." History of the Church, 646. The changed historical document, among many, was discovered in the Joseph Smith Papers project. A transcription of the relevant changed text appears in it. Note the "to be revised" statement near the arrow at the illustration's lower left. They appear in a different scribe's handwriting, which appears to match that of the revisions made. The revisions change the whole meaning of Joseph's words. The definitive words, "Joseph forbids it and the practice thereof," are crossed out and replaced with verbiage similar to what is found in Doctrine and Covenants 132. The edited version was changed to say what is found in the outline area of the illustration. The 1850s editor left extra space around the part where Joseph unequivocally forbids the practice of plural marriage. This was a favorite tactic of Freemasonry devotee Heber C. Kimball. He, Kimball, and Young had editors like William Clayton carried out this form of editing repeatedly. It is a pattern found in many official historical documents from the Nauvoo era. Clayton modified a number of entries in the Masonic Lodge Book too as well. Some of these modifications include post-dating and antedating entries, as well as omitting other entries. One of these modified entries involved 10 names, 2 of them being Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon. They were men not admitted to the Freemasonry Lodge at that time. Kimball and Young were both members of the craft before joining Mormonism. The Lord uses the word craft in mostly negative ways in Scripture. It comes from the Hebrew aram, meaning serpent, subtle, crafty, or shrewd. Satan inspires secret or hidden things from the Hebrew sod, like his blood oaths with Cain. I'll have links to these changes in the video description. By October of 1843, known irregularities in the record-keeping of Nauvoo Masonic Lodge and other concerns led to the denial of a charter for the Mormon Lodge and a revocation of its dispensation. Minute Book 2, once housed in the Nauvoo Masonic Lodge cornerstone, was obtained by President David O. McKay in 1954 and now resides in church vaults in Salt Lake City. It may have much to say. Changing Stories typically revolves around lies to protect the guilty. The changing stories tied to how and when polygamy originated in the church are evident in the statements hereafter. Though Joseph Smith never claimed to have had a revelation on polygamy, Brigham Young claimed that he did have one on polygamy, and many years after Joseph was murdered, additional so-called evidence used by the church to support the narrative that Joseph was a polygamist is presented in the following statements by William Clayton, Orson Pratt, and Brigham Young. Now I say to you, as I am ready to testify to all the world, and on which testimony I am most willing to meet all the Latter-day Saints and all apostates in time and through all eternity, I did write the revelation on celestial marriage given through the prophet Joseph Smith on the 12th of July, 1843. William Clayton Journal, said to be written in 1842 through 46. Though dated as 1843, Clayton's wording suggests a much later date, perhaps as late as 1874, when Young made new claims tied to it. According to Clayton, he, Hiram, and Joseph were the only ones present when he wrote down this revelation in the Whitney store. Two of these witnesses are conveniently dead. Neither supported polygamy. Official church sources today claim that the open practice of polygamy as part of doctrine occurred in 1852 in Utah, or 22 years after the Book of Mormon was published. This foundational document speaks out against it clearly. See Jacob chapter 2 and 3. Under the direction of Brigham Young, Apostle Orson Pratt published The Seer in the same year, 1852, a pro-polygamy document distributed by the church. In 1859, Apostle Pratt stated, 13 years after the publication of the Book of Mormon, 1830, the same prophet received a revelation upon marriage which commanded certain individuals in this church to take unto themselves a plurality of wives for time and all eternity, declaring that it is a righteous principle and was practiced by inspired men in time of old. In 1879, Apostle Pratt added, the revelation on polygamy was not given until some 13 years after the rise of the church, and that was after we had been driven and smitten and scattered to and fro here and there by the hands of our enemies. Hence, it was not for that we were persecuted. This and Pratt's prior statements reveal that for 20 years, 1859 to 1879, Elder Pratt understood that Joseph Smith's revelation on polygamy was neither received by nor given to Joseph Smith until 1843. Both of Pratt's statements align with the story of William Clayton. Young's 1874 public statement about his revelation on polygamy while in England opposes Orson's statements. He claimed he, Brigham, received a revelation while serving in England 1839 to 40 that justified the practice of polygamy, and he said that Joseph had never mentioned anything about polygamy to him or others prior to it, and that there had never been a thought of polygamy in the church at that time. From 1874 forward, the story changed, that the revelation was only recorded on July 12th of 1843 by Clayton. In other words, Joseph had received this revelation much earlier, in the early 1830s. President Brigham Young's new changed 1874 story opened a can of worms. First, according to President Young, God was now giving revelations to Young, not the prophet Joseph, and for a new church-wide doctrine. Even while Joseph was yet alive, God said only Joseph was to receive revelations for the church. Secondly, Brigham's supposed revelation on polygamy came before 1843, before Joseph's supposed revelation, now D&C 132. Third, Brigham took full responsibility for having the first revelation on polygamy for the whole church, while he was on a mission in England in 1839-40. As he said, Joseph never mentioned it, and there had never been a thought of it in the church. Fourth, later in 1899, President Lorenzo Snow later backed up Brigham's story, claiming that he too had a revelation on polygamy while in England, supporting the practice. Deseret Semi-Weekly News, June 6, 1899. According to Karen, the omissions, deletions, and unidentified additions tell us much more of what transpired than do those items that remained in their original form. Moreover, there is much more truth to be had in the journals of Heber C. Kimball and William Clayton than in all of the church's written history combined. Also, Brigham's compiled history, referred to as Brigham's Manuscript History or Journal, was helpful in exposing the extent to which he and his religious progeny rewrote history to fit their narrative. Toward the end of 1839 to the beginning of 1843, the period that both temple worship and spiritual wifery were infused into Joseph's church in Nauvoo, the personal journals of Joseph, Heber, and Brigham go silent, a veritable blackout period for record keeping, a peculiar activity for a peculiar record-keeping people. Luckily, I came upon a document that exposes not only irregularities in the record-keeping of the Nauvoo Lodge, but also in the Masonic Temple documents. These records were created, manipulated, partially destroyed, and then pilfered by Heber Kimball and William Clayton and taken to Salt Lake. This not only explains why their journals go silent, they were extremely busy doing something else, but it also puts the LDS history regarding the temple and temple endowment into a more reasonable, clear, and common sense perspective, Karen added. In the post-Brigham spin room, they had one mission: find something on Joseph that creates a preponderance of impropriety that we can spin into plural marriage. And that one thing by the church in the late 1800s was the fragmentary Fanny Alger story. She was a 15-year-old young woman working for the Smith family. She apparently had a crush on Joseph. Emma and Joseph were aware of it. She had to be dismissed because of it. Some took note and the rumor spread. One of these Fanny Alger rumors was later used by the church to frame Joseph as a polygamist in the early 1830s. It was a letter written from one former anti-Mormon preacher to another with a plan to accuse Joseph of something so that they could diminish his influence over members of their churches, former members that were converting to Mormonism. It took money out of their pockets as preachers. They also wanted to bring about Joseph's fall. The accusations and plans of these two anti-Mormon preachers is hardly strong evidence. Nevertheless, the Fanny Alger story began to take root. It was later utilized by Brighamite leaders to incriminate Joseph, that they might justify themselves in the practice, having been part of it since the 1840s. The year 1835 is given by pro-polygamists for a possible secret marriage date for Joseph and Fanny, performed by Oliver Cowdery. In 1838, Cowdery was excommunicated from the church, at real odds with Joseph. He does not say anything about Joseph and Fanny in his church court, but supposedly does so in a letter to his apostate brother Warren. In that supposed letter, Oliver accuses Joseph of a dirty, nasty affair. There is no marriage. The story that a marriage or sealing occurred was later put in place to overcome the possible embarrassment of adultery rather than plural marriage. Note the words of researcher Brian Hales about the Fanny Alger evidence. He is one of the premier pro-polygamy LDS scholars, and yet his own words reveal real problems with the Fanny Alger evidence. To date, 19 different references to the Joseph Smith Fanny Alger relationship has been identified in the historical record. Hopefully, more will come to light in the future. An analysis of the various narratives show that the first reference was written on January 22, 1838. Probably 2 or 3 years after the event. No contemporaneous records have been located. Also, 15 of the accounts were composed at least 37 years after the incident. 13 of the narratives are second-hand. The first published reference to Fanny Alger by her full name occurred in 1881, although her first name was used in an 1875 anti-Mormon book, Wife Number 19, written by Anne Eliza Webb Young in 1875. Regardless, most church members would not have known anything about her until Andrew Jensen mentioned her as one of the first plural wives sealed to the prophet in his 1887 article in the Historical Record. Hales, Joseph Smith Polygamy, Volume 2. The Fanny Alger evidence is nothing more than a proposed plan to stop Joseph from taking converts away from 2 anti-Mormon pastors. In a letter from one to another, it contained their false accusations against Joseph. This shoddy evidence would never stand up in a reputable court of law. Since the Nauvoo days, the prophet Joseph Smith has become a scapegoat and a stone of stumbling for many, all to protect the current narrative. It is no longer necessary. Truth about our real history would stop much of the bleeding, so many leaving the church. Truly, as Moroni said, Joseph's name has been had for both good and evil. Speaking of the night of the angel's first visit to Joseph on Rosh Hashanah of 1823, the prophet Joseph stated, "He, the angel, called me by name and said unto me that he was a messenger sent from the presence of God to me, and that his name was Moroni, or Nephi, depending on the source, that God had a work for me to do, and that my name should be had for good and evil among all nations, kindreds, and tongues, or that it should be both good and evil spoken of among all people." Joseph Smith History.